what's currently going on the ground in Ukraine, unfiltered, where this thing is, how much longer this is going to last, and who you think the victor will be.
Well, let me preface that by saying, unlike when I spoke out about weapons of mass destruction, where you literally could take my word and go to the bank with it, because it was not just what I believed to be the truth. It was the truth. It was fact-based, facts that I personally investigated, facts that I personally uncovered, which is one of the reasons why I felt so strongly about speaking out. Today, I'm thousands of miles away from where the action is taking place.
Right.
You know, I haven't been on active service now for coming on 30 years.
Yeah.
So when you say unfiltered, I have to say, I'm sorry, I can't give you unfiltered. I'm going to give you the Ritter filter, because that's all I can offer you. I'm somebody who is thousands of miles distance, and I am prisoner to the same data that everybody else is prisoner to, that which is publicly released. I don't have a special phone that I can call up the Kremlin and get the inside scoop from Vladimir Putin, or call up Zelensky and say, hey, tell me what's really going on the ground.
Yeah.
I don't have friends fighting on the front lines of either side. I've got nothing. I've got exactly what everybody else has, with one exception. I have my personal experiences as a military officer, and I have a lifetime of doing this very task, receiving fragments of data, trying to discern which ones have more viability than the others, and then use them to piece together a 1,000 piece puzzle with only 52 pieces and tell you what the puzzle's supposed to mean.
Got it.
I did that for a living.
Yeah.
I did a very good job of it. If that was the case, I could have hanging on my wall, you know, about 6 different 1,000 piece puzzles where I predicted perfectly what it would be with 52 pieces, and predicted it to very senior audiences from the President of the United States on down.
Yeah.
So that's another reason why I feel comfortable doing this, because normally on something of this complexity, I would not want to put myself out there, because who am I to interject myself into the mainstream discussion, et cetera. I'm just one of a million different voices. But on this issue, I feel I do have something to offer, not as the source,
right,
but as a source, meaning that I feel comfortable being used as a tool by others so that they can better formulate their own opinions. I'm not here to dictate anything to anybody, unlike Iraq, where I was dictating, because there was no way I was wrong, and history proved me so. Today, man, I could be as wrong as the day is long. I mean, who knows what the heck's going on there? I'm simply providing filtered information, the data that's filtered through the vehicle of Scot Ritter. And I feel comfortable with this data. So now to answer your question, we are 4+ months into a war that I didn't believe was going to last more than a month, which tells you right off the bat, you know, we got an issue here, because, you know, nobody has perfect data. I believed that Russia was going to initiate a military conflict with Ukraine by bringing to bear the totality of its military potential. And I believe that that military potential was going to be sufficiently violent enough to break Ukrainian resistance in rapid order.
Right.
I was wrong. The Russians did not bring to bear the totality of their military potential in a focused effort. They didn't go to war against Ukraine. I thought they were going to go to war against Ukraine. They instead instituted something called a special military operation, which is different from anything that has ever been done in modern military history. I can't think of any situation where combat of this scale has been fought with so many constraints placed on the initiator. Normally, when you initiate offensive military action, you seek to do so where you have, the majority of advantages. You wait, for instance, until the moon is gone so that your aircraft can fly across a darkened sky, difficult to see. You wait until the enemy has lowered most of their defenses. You seek to secretly accumulate power, etc. That's not what happened here. The Russians were just straight up. We got 200,000 people on your border. Here they are.
Yeah.
And we're coming in now, but we're not going to blow you away. We're going to come in and we're going to try and negotiate our way through the villages, the towns, the cities. We're trying to convince the Ukrainian army to stay in the barracks, not to fight, to convince the people to step aside, not resist, because our goals, our objectives are pure. We mean Ukraine no harm. We simply have to get rid of this threat that has manifested itself.
Yeah.
Why did the Russians believe that? I don't know. They haven't come out and formally said so. We have some hints based upon the firing of hundreds of intelligence officers from the FSB, the Russian Federal Security Forces, who are part of the 5th Department or Directorate, which is responsible for what's called the near abroad, those former Soviet states that surround the periphery of present-day Russian Federation. Mm-hmm. And the Ukraine, of course, is obviously one of these near abroads. And it appears that they had conducted a very extensive intelligence preparation of the battlefield type operation, where they went in and talked with, bribed, cajoled, blackmailed, whatever term you want to use, a number of Ukrainian military officers and civilian officials, sufficient for the military to believe that they would be able to move rapidly forward without resistance. So the goal of the special military operation was to move in as quickly as possible, get as far into Ukraine as possible in order to confront the Ukrainian government with a fait accompli, meaning Russia's here, there's nothing you can do about it. Right. You need to concede to the Russian demands, which were simple. One, you aren't going to join NATO. Two, you're going to get rid of these Nazis. And mm-hmm. Three, all the NATO infrastructure that you've incorporated into your military over the past 8 years has got to go. We're going to demilitarize, denazify, and you're going to be neutral. Right. Oh, and by the way, Donbass, they're already declared independent, so you're going to have to recognize that.
Right.
That didn't happen.
No.
The Russian military forces, as they moved in, were sucked into traps. Apparently, the people that told the FSB that they would cooperate either were working for the Ukrainian intelligence services, meaning they were double agents, mm-hmm. or they just flat out lied, or the FSB made a mistake. I think this will go down in history as one of the greatest intelligence failures in modern times. If this is indeed what happened, it's a huge intelligence failure, a big black mark against the Russians. And it's one that, isn't just an embarrassment. It resulted in the loss of thousands of lives as Russian convoys drove into elaborate traps that were set by the Ukrainian military, ambushes, not just using Javelin missiles, but artillery ambushes, meaning pre-registered fires. As a Russian column moved in, they pick out the first vehicle, the last vehicle, and then they would just obliterate the column with artillery that had already been registered on the target. And they destroyed thousands of vehicles. They killed thousands of Russians. It was a slaughter, an absolute slaughter. Yeah. But still, then the Russians continued to go in with what's called this special military operation. The goal of the Russians was not to kill Ukrainian soldiers in large numbers. They weren't trying to eliminate the army by slaughtering them. They're trying to get them to surrender. Mm-hmm. They weren't there to punish the Ukrainian population. They didn't view the Ukrainian population as a hostile population. They weren't trying to destroy Ukrainian infrastructure. But what happened is, because of this failure, this abject failure at the front, the Russians had to shift gears. And shifting gears in combat is a very difficult thing because you're under fire. The enemy is now engaged, and you have to adapt to them. And there was this very difficult period where the Russians were compelled to realign their force structure, realign their objectives, realign how they were doing things. And we'll call this phase one of the fight. Phase one ended sometime in mid-March. By the time phase one ended, the Russians had reshaped the battlefield. Their original shaping was done by the intelligence services. That was a mistake. They had now reshaped the battlefield, meaning that they had successfully engaged Ukrainian military forces, fixed them in location. They had done maneuvering that forced Ukrainians to dissipate their reserves, sending them up to Kiev, down to Odessa, anywhere but to the east. And then they used air power and missiles to degrade Ukrainian command and control, logistics, ammunition, fuel, etc., so that the Ukrainian military was now fixed in a position that was to the advantage of Russia. Remember when I said you want to launch offensive operations when all of the advantages accrue to you? By the end of phase one, the Russians had painfully shaped the battlefield. They suffered egregious losses, but so were the Ukrainians. I mean, the fact is, as many losses as the Russians suffered, the Ukrainians were losing men and equipment at a rate of around 5 to 6 to 1, meaning that for every Russian dead, there were 5 to 6 Ukrainian dead. That's not a sustainable method, but now we move to phase two. Phase two stopped being, even though they called it a special military operation, the gloves came off. The Russians now have the enemy fixed where they want, and they begin the process of grinding them down. Now, a lot of people thought that phase two would be World War II-like in its maneuver, meaning large arrows on a map, busting through the Ukrainian lines, sweeping around, encircling them like they did with the Germans. Is the Russian army capable of doing this? Yeah. But if you study World War II, even though, for instance, right now is the anniversary of Operation Bagration, one of the greatest military offenses in the history of the world, fought against Army Group Center in Belarus in World War II, where the Soviet Army annihilated a Russian or German army group. And you're like, yay, they beat the Germans, yay, yay, yay. They suffered over 1 million dead. The Soviets. In winning this great victory, they suffered over 1 million dead because great victories don't come without great sacrifice. And Russia, the one thing that didn't change with the special military operation is it didn't become a war, meaning they didn't mobilize. They still were limited to those 200,000 troops, some of which were reinforced, but they never became much greater than that. Russia can't afford to do a World War II type assault. So what they've done instead is they've just decided they are going to grind them down kilometer by kilometer, mile by mile. And it's a more difficult fight because they're fighting on terrain that the Ukrainians have had 8 years to prepare. They've entrenched themselves. They have reinforced concrete bunkers. They have in-depth things. So as the Russians approach, as a tank approaches a line, it can be hit from multiple angles. So the Russians now, before they move a tank in, which is a death trap for the guys in the tank, they have to eliminate all this. How do they do this? Artillery. This has become an artillery war. And Russia has the advantage. Today, it's widely accepted, and nobody is contradicting these numbers, so I'm comfortable repeating them, that the Ukrainians are firing between 5,000 to 6,000 rounds of artillery a day. That's a lot. But it's not, it's a lot. The Russians are firing 60 to 75,000 artillery rounds a day. To put that in perspective, during Desert Storm, all of Desert Storm, the United States fired 60,000 artillery rounds for the whole operation. The Russians are exceeding that on a daily basis. And they're crunching, they're grinding, they're destroying the Ukrainian military, one village, one strong point at a time. They crush it, they drive them back. They crush, they drive back. they're creating small cauldrons where they're surrounding 500, 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 Ukrainian soldiers at a time. And they've come up with a formula that is almost, there are Russian casualties. Let's never forget that the Ukrainian military is very large, very large military, 260,000 active duty troops, nearly 1 million reservists and territorial defense forces, very well equipped, very well equipped, very well led, very well trained, especially those units have been given the benefit of 7 years of NATO training, participating in NATO exercises, having NATO instructors on the ground. The United States prides itself in having trained 5 battalions of Ukrainian forces a year to NATO standards, and then bragging about how they sent them off to fight in the Donbass to kill Russians.
Yeah.
So it's a very big army, and if you give an army with this kind of capability and opportunity, they'll punch. And that fist is going to hit, and when it hits, it hurts.
Yeah.
And every once in a while, the Russians, because nobody's perfect, they make a mistake, they make an error, the Ukrainians take advantage of it, and Russians die. But right now, the Russians are slaughtering the Ukrainians on the battlefield overwhelmingly, and they're grinding them down. They're pushing them back. It's a slow, bloody, laborious process, but it has taken on an air of certainty, meaning that when you look at a battlefield, to give you an example, when we crossed over on Normandy on D-Day 1944 with our European allies, we initiated a battle with the Germans on French soil, and it was touch and go there for a minute. It was tough. But when Patton broke out and began his big sweep, and they pushed the Germans out of France into the Benelux area, and we got right up to the German border, the war was over. Germany was not going to recover from that. Right. Now, there was still the Battle of the Bulge. There was still the Battle of the Hurtgen Forest. There were still the bloody battles that ensued that killed tens of thousands of American soldiers. The war wasn't over, meaning they surrendered. It just meant that the outcome was not going to be altered. The same thing after the Battle of Kursk in 1943, when the Soviets defeated the last major German offensive operation. It's July, August 1943. The war doesn't end until May 1945 when the Soviets take Berlin. But the war was over, meaning that Germany was not going to recover from this. There was no games that could be played in terms of moving troops on a map and all this. Anybody looking at that went, we now know the Soviet Union is going to take Berlin. We now know in 1944 that the United States is going, and the British and the French and the Canadians are going to drive, and they're going to head towards Berlin, and that in between them are Germans who can't win. Right. We are at that point right now. The Ukrainians cannot win. They can't. It's over. It's all over but the shouting, the screaming, the dying. The Ukrainians apparently are going to continue to fight on. And they're being helped by the NATO, the West, the United States, who are providing them with tens of billions of dollars worth of modern equipment, which means that the fighting that is going to occur is going to be bloody. It's going to be violent. Russians are going to die. But Russia will not lose this fight. Russia cannot lose this fight unless there's an absolute loss of political will. And while I don't know Vladimir Putin personally, from what I've read about him, I don't think he's the kind of guy that wakes up in the morning and says, I made a mistake in Ukraine, I'm going to surrender today. I think he's committed to victory. I think the Russian people are committed to victory. The Russian military is committed to victory, and there will be a victory. It will take time. We have a hint on how much time. Denis Pushilin, the president of the Donetsk People's Republic, spoke at the St. Petersburg Economic Forum last week on Russian soil at a forum hosted by the Russian president. So one would assume that his words have been carefully considered. And he said that the special military operation will probably end sometime by the end of the year. So we have months of fighting ahead, but it's months of fighting where the Russians are in 100% control of what's going on the battlefield. And what's going on the battlefield is that the Ukrainians are dying at a prodigious rate. We're talking hundreds, in some cases thousands of dead